Welcome, everyone, to another Kavli conversation on science communication. My name is Dan Fagan. I'm a professor of science journalism here at the Carter Institute of Journalism, the director of the Science, Health, and Environmental Reporting Program and the Science Communication Workshops. And this is going to be an unusual Kavli because we're going to talk about poop. And poop is something that we don't often talk about, and it's definitely something we don't talk enough about for all kinds of interesting reasons that we're going to learn about. We're very, very grateful to have two poopy authors with us that wrote really terrific books almost simultaneously. Lina's book came out a few months before Bryn's. But they're both very interesting books, and I will leave it to Anna to formally introduce Lina and Bryn, but just want to thank both of them for coming. In Bryn's case, all the way from across country, and in Lina's case, all the way from Queens. So we're grateful to them both. I will introduce Anna Rothschild. This is her first in-person Kavli conversation as one of our permanent hosts of the Kavli Conversations. Anna is a wonderful science journalist. She is a video maker extraordinaire and a wonderful communicator, as well as a really good writer. Her current position is that she's the senior video producer for 538. And I would urge you to go to 538 and check out some of her work, both as a producer and also appearing. The conversations that she has sort of narrated. So with that, Anna, take it away, and we're all going to have a really shitty time.
Thanks, Dan. I really couldn't be more excited about today's event. As Dan said, I'm Anna. I have built a large part of my career reporting on disgusting things in science. Now I report on politics mostly, which some might argue is also disgusting in its way. But tonight we're going to talk about poop. And we're going to talk about poop in a number of different ways. We're going to talk a little bit about poop as a challenge that requires some of the greatest minds in science and engineering to solve. But more than that, we're going to talk about poop as a solution to some of the world's biggest problems like climate change and illness. And joining me to do that are Bryn Nelson. Bryn is an author who has a PhD in microbiology, and he wrote a wonderful book called Flush, The Remarkable Science of an Unlikely Treasure. And also with me is Lina Zeldovich, who is a journalist and the author of The Other Dark Matter, The Science and Business of Turning Waste into Wealth and Health. Both books are excellent. I highly recommend you grab a copy. So thank you both for joining me.
Thanks so much for having us.
Pleasure. So I would like to just start off by pointing out that both Bryn and Lina have come in character with their outfits. Bryn, would you like to show off your socks?
Oh, yes.
Bryn's a little more subtle.
And Lina's just head to toe poop right now, so. So Lina pointed out when we had a Zoom call a few months ago that this week is actually the perfect time to be having this conversation because it is World Toilet Day on Saturday.
Yep. November 19th.
So let's start by talking about the toilet. Lina, why don't you sort of kick us off by telling us what happens usually in major cities, at least in the Western world, when you flush the toilet?
Well, whatever you deposit in it swirls down through the pipes probably for like miles and miles and miles until it reaches a wastewater treatment plant, which is a really, really bad name because it makes it sound like it's like a really ugly place and we don't want to talk about it. We don't want to go there. We don't even want to know it exists for as long as it does what it's supposed to do. What it does, it basically goes through different stages of cleaning that output that comes to it, which by the time it comes to it has all sorts of things in it like you wouldn't believe, and it's not just plastic bottles and other garbage. When I was interviewing people at one of the wastewater treatment plants here in New York City, they told me that one day they had this huge ball of yarn, and they started to undoing that ball of yarn and undoing it and undoing it, and out came a bike.
An entire adult-sized bicycle.
Yeah. All kinds of construction garbage ends up there. So the wastewater treatment plant takes, separates it all, and then sends this massive amount of sludge, as they call it, through different levels of treatments. At the end of which the water that comes out of it is so clean, at least in New York City and other major cities, that you can, technically speaking, drink it. Although we don't drink it, it generally is released into waterways. And what happens with the rest is a really long story that nobody wants to talk about, because the rest of it is what's called biosolids. This industry is full of euphemisms, biosolids. Nobody wants them, and nobody knows what to do with them. And in the past, they would burn them, they would flush some in the ocean, they still landfilling it, and here's one of New York's dirty secrets that no one wants to talk about, is that they load it up on the train and send it to Alabama.
What happens once it gets there?
Well, it stinks. Well, supposedly it's dumped someplace, that what the so-called land reclamation from mining or whatever, it's actually not a bad idea, it's actually a good idea. Poop makes really good soil, but the train stinks. The Alabama town doesn't want it. They protest every now and then. The train, at some point, I think about 2 years ago, they couldn't send it there anymore. I don't know what happened with all that poo in the meantime. I can't get it out of anybody. I think it's like a really big, dirty secret. I think a few months ago it started going again. I'm sure the town is going to protest again then. It's a really awesome journalism story if you can actually dig to the bottom of it. Seriously.
Literally. What are some of the issues with the current way we deal with poop, at least in America?
Well, as Lina said, I mean, we still burn or bury a lot of our waste. And basically what we're doing is we're removing ourselves from what has long been this recycling system, nature's recycling system. I mean, if you think about it, the way that nature recycles nutrients like phosphorus, like nitrogen, water, there's this continuous loop. And one of the researchers that I talked to talked about the idea that megafauna in the past, woolly mammoths, large ocean and land animals, were actually really important for this kind of relay of phosphorus from the deep ocean up back into the land. So it's this kind of continuous loop. We've sort of removed ourselves from it, and we have, in the process, basically put poop where it is the least useful for anything. And even when we landfill it, there's a lot of problems because the landfills will leach. So you will sometimes have, phosphorus and nitrogen leaking into groundwater. We know that methane gas leaks into the atmosphere. That's a greenhouse gas contributing to global warming. And now some of these landfills have tried to capture that. But you keep creating problems, and then you have to come up with new solutions to the problems, when if you were just working with nature, you would be able to solve a lot of those issues. So part of, I think, the resetting that we're both talking about with our books is kind of thinking of this not as a problem, but as a solution. And, how do we treat poop safely, so that we can not make people sick with it, but also in a way that is in line with how it's supposed to work. Poop happens to be a very good growing medium for plants. It always has been. So I think, part of this is just kind of recalibrating our relationship with our bodies. We don't like to talk about it, but it's a very valuable resource, and has been for, millions of years.
One thing, I can't remember whose book it was, Lina, it might have been yours, or maybe you both talked about this. One thing that had never occurred to me before is, phosphorus and nitrogen are extremely important elements. They're extremely useful in agriculture and many other uses. But something that had never occurred to me is that as we get most of our food from other parts of the world, we're actually we're stripping those elements from where they grow, and then we're trashing them places that we don't really need them, or where it actually is harmful. And for example, it has a knock-on effect on our marshlands, which I think you both talk about. Mm-hmm. So what are some solutions for what we do, how we can sort of reclaim? We can talk about, there are many different things in poop that we can talk about using, but first maybe let's talk about nitrogen and phosphorus. What are some strategies for reclaiming those and using them, and maybe even bringing them back to the people who need them?
So even in the best case scenario, when wastewater treatment plants clean the wastewater and release it into the environment safely, this water is still full of nutrients. In most cases, it still is. The nitrogen is still there, the phosphorus is still there. A lot of it is in biosolids, but a lot of it actually remains in that water. And when that water flows out into the environment, into the bodies of water like lakes, rivers, or marshes, it fertilizes all the wrong things. It fertilizes these bodies of water that it shouldn't. And the problem it causes is, like, we've all heard of the toxicology blooms. We all heard of the coastal marshes and mangrove forests falling apart. Part of it is the way we treat our sewage. We let too much nutrients into the environment, into the water, where it shouldn't be. The way to deal with it is use smarter, newer technologies that can capture all of the nutrient-rich elements out of the water, and keep them in the so-called biosolids. Biosolids can be treated in various ways, sometimes with safe chemicals like lime, or better pressure cooked in massive pressure cookers and similar machines. So once this is done, there is no pathogens left alive in them. They can be further composted, and there are some treatment plants that are doing so in this country and Europe. And what comes out at the very end, is essentially garden dirt, or close enough of what they call grade A fertilizer that can be put into the fields, can be used in city parks, can be used in apple farms to grow apples and other things. That's kind of like my very short answer, and we can spend another 2 hours talking about the actual technologies.
Yeah. A couple other examples. There's a wastewater treatment plant in Oregon that has 4 different facilities, and they've tried a number of different things to reclaim some of the phosphorus and the nutrients. And one of the things that they've did is realize that this can be a very valuable commodity, selling it back to farmers. And so they've actually, there's a mineral called struvite, and struvite is basically an accumulation of different minerals, has phosphorus in it, and it tends to be kind of the worst nightmare for wastewater treatment plants because it will basically form on the inside of pipes, and it can clog the inside of a wastewater treatment plant. So it tends to be this really, kind of like fatbergs. That's another really disgusting, gross thing that's kind of the bane of a lot of wastewater treatment plants, and we can talk a little bit about that later. But basically what they've done is they've taken another problem and turned it into a solution, because they've developed a way that they can actually seed some of these phosphorus on basically like a pearl, is the same idea. And you get layer upon layer upon layer upon layer of the mineral. So it actually forms a phosphorus-rich fertilizer pellet. And so they're taking that out of the wastewater stream, And then they can basically resell that to farmers as fertilizer. And the really amazing thing about this particular example is that this form of phosphorus is usually insoluble, so it won't run off into rivers and streams the way that normal fertilizer would. Instead, it's activated by a drop in pH. And what happens is plant roots, when they need more nutrients, they release citric acid. Citric acid will actually drop the pH of the soil, and it makes this form of phosphorus now available to the plant. So you're actually working with the plant to help feed it this phosphorus. So I think it was just such a genius way of turning something that would go into the environment, like Lina said, leading to dead zones, to eutrophication, and now you're basically turning it into commodity that we need. So that's another one of, and there's many, many other great examples of that, but that's another one that I thought was pretty spectacular.
How common is it for, at least we can talk about around the world, but in the United States at least, how common is it for us to be using nitrogen and phosphorus reclaimed from poop in agriculture?
It depends on the historic time frame, actually, because previous generations were probably more efficient before the synthetic fertilizer became so widely available and cheap. Again, before somebody realized how polluting it is to produce it and how bad it is actually to keep on using it year after year because it doesn't stay in the soil. In the 1800s, there was this idea of sewage farms. I talk about it in my book. It's something that I didn't know existed when I started working on the book. So there was sort of this idea that several cities tried to implement. Wastewater treatment plants would, accept the sewage coming in. They would then pump it onto the farms using steam, on the farms outside the city, using steam power. And there were several quite successful sewage farms back then. One of the really, really successful ones was right outside Chicago. It ran for 20 or 30 years, I don't remember now. But part of its success was that the town was kind of small. I think it was 6,000 people. So the whole thing worked because the farms were close enough to the city, the pipes weren't very long, the machinery didn't have to work too hard. Some of these farms existed in Europe too, and for some reason they just petered out, probably because synthetic fertilizer was just so much more efficient and other cleaning technologies became more efficient and it sort of became not necessary. I think right now we're coming back sort of full circle to it. So 10, 20 years ago, I would say not a lot. I think now there's kind of a definite uptick in how we can use this better, how we can recycle it better. There's definitely more technologies and more interest and more plants that are coming, jumping onto this idea that, hey, we can use this better and maybe even make some money on it. Turn it into biogas, burn it, spin some turbines, create electricity. I think right now is a really interesting moment, kind of like this pivoting moment in history, which is kind of interesting to watch.
Yeah.
Kind of a poop renaissance.
Exactly.
But it is true. It does depend on where you are in the country, there's also the matter of disgust, and we can talk about that as well. But the closer that you are to the farm, the more that you tend to value this because about manure, right? And farmers have used manure for centuries. We fought war over bird guano. So it's that has always been deemed incredibly valuable. But there's this sort of mental leap then to say, okay, well, human manure can also be very valuable. But it was quietly in the background in a lot of places in sort of farm communities. Colorado now has a waiting list for farmers that want the biosolids. Same with Washington. A lot of the biosolids that are reclaimed and amended, turned into fertilizer, they go to eastern Washington, to wheat fields, they go to forestry projects. And they used to give it away for free. They still do in a lot of cases, because then they didn't have to worry about what to pay to landfill it, and farmers wanted it. Now it's become a little bit more of a business, so that now you have some of these names where different wastewater treatment plants are actually starting to brand their compost. And there are all of these like very aspirational names, Loop and Bloom and and Dilladur, but it's true. Yeah, but I think that has also kind of helped get people talking about it and sort of normalize the idea.
Well, and also, it's not like this is a new idea at all. This is actually a return to a very old idea, where in many parts of the world, as you both write about, poop was like a big commodity and was extremely valuable. Can you give us some stats on just in certain parts of the world, like Japan, for example, how much poop was valued in different parts in history?
Yeah, so there's the China and Japan, like if you think of the 1600s, yes, poop was a massive commodity. Usually I tell this story in 1734, 1739, there was this emperor of the Qing dynasty in China. And so one day he looked to the south part of his kingdom and saw that the fields were fertile and prosperous, and in the northern part of the kingdom, nothing would grow and cities were dirty. And so he issued this decree called treasure night soil as if it were gold. And night soil was that poop. That's how the Chinese referred to it. And so he made sure that everywhere in his country, the poop was collected in those cities and taken and shipped and trucked to the country where farmers would use it to grow food. There was a similar picture in Japan. In Japan, there is even a specific word for it. It was called shimagoye, which meant fertilizer from the bottom of a person. And in some parts of Japan, during like particularly bad years, whether they had famines or whatnot, there were poop wars where farmers would argue who had the rights to collect excrement from what part of the big city they were connected to. And people used to steal excrement from their neighbors, and they were sent to prison for doing so because it was such an incredible commodity. It was so valued. Like completely unimaginable by our standards. And here's another little, Japanese, slice of Japanese culture from that time, which I've learned. If you were coming to a friend's house for dinner, a polite thing to do at the end of it was to go to the bathroom in that friend's house and leave a gift. And people who didn't do that were considered rude.
Incredible. Love it. So different from today.
There's one other example from Brazil, from the Amazon. There's a part of the Amazon that's unusually fertile. It's called Terra Preta de Indio, or dark earth, Amazonian dark earths. And they were trying to figure out why things grew so much better in these particular areas than the other areas. And what they figured out was that they basically had latrines that they had used. They also used it in some cases as sort of like rubbish piles. But the supposition is that they figured out basically that, hey, these areas grow incredibly well, these plants. And so in different parts of the Amazon, you actually had these garden cities where they were able to grow different layers of crops. So it was a very intensive agricultural practice, but you basically had unusually fertile soil, and based on the soil and the farming techniques, they were able to support a very large population, and a larger population than a lot of archaeologists and anthropologists initially thought could be supported. So in that case, you had these Amazonian dark earths that were literally supporting, cities. Not by our standards, but we're talking in the thousands of people.
Yeah, amazing. So we've talked a bit about using poop as fertilizer, very, very old practice. One thing that you both talk about in your books is using poop as fuel, which also has a long history, but you both talk about using it in different ways. So what are some ways that we can use poop to actually power our cities?
Well, I mean, biogas is in and of itself a really interesting fuel. And so basically, we all, or many of us, make biogas on a regular basis. Pyroflatulence is the name for lighting your farts on fire. And yes, it is a real thing. They proved this on Mythbusters. But I don't.
I was wondering if you knew that from personal
experience. No, I have not tried this myself. It is a dangerous. It is a dangerous party trick, so I don't recommend it. But the reason for that is because we have a number of different microbes that live in our guts. So we have bacteria. We also have archaea. And there are a particular type of archaea microbes. They're called methanogens. And methanogens is part of their life cycle, part of their metabolism. They create a methane. And so biogas is methane, it's carbon dioxide, it's some other things. But basically, wastewater treatment plants have figured out how to essentially replicate the conditions of the human gut. So you have these anaerobic conditions, so no oxygen, where the bugs are happy. And, Lina talked a little bit before about kind of like the pressure cookers. That's one way to kind of explode some of the organic matter and create this kind of food source for these methanogens. So they create an enormous amount of biogas. Biogas can be used for things like buses. So one of the wastewater treatment plants that I visited in Norway, in Oslo, they were actually using biogas to power a fraction of their city buses. So it's literally poop-powered city buses. And so by doing that, they're basically sort of also closing the loop on the energy needs for the wastewater plant. So what they're also doing then is kind of cutting down on their carbon footprint, right? Because they're using some of this energy in a way to power some of the equipment. And if you can create biogas, then you can create, a whole bunch of other different types of fuels, and Lina can talk about that.
Well, you can use biogas to burn biogas, spin the turbines, and create electricity. I've talked to a startup in Israel that built these mini digesters. Not the big, humongous digesters that are used at the wastewater treatment plants, but small ones that an individual family can use. Families who live off the grid or in like really very rural places where there are no other sources of energy other than, let's say, cutting down trees. Another little startup in Kenya designed a different way to do it. They basically collect poo from little villages and mix it with various agricultural waste that burns well. They mold it and shape it into these burnable briquettes, and it burns really well. It burns just like charcoal. So people buy this charcoal, new form of charcoal, poop coal, whatever you want to call it, from them, and they don't have to cut down trees and make charcoal anymore. And the president of this company, it's called Innovation, told me it's really cool how it works. We buy shit from people and we sell them their shit back, just in a different form, and we save trees that way. Like, mind-boggling. So simple and so mind-boggling. One of my favorites here in the Western world was something that was a method developed at the Pacific Northwest Laboratories in collaboration with a wastewater treatment plant in Canada, in Vancouver. So one day, this Vancouver people send a bunch of buckets with sewage sludge across the border. I kept asking them, like, what paperwork do you fill out for that? It was a ton of paperwork. And scientists at the Pacific Northwest Laboratories, PNNL, they loaded this up into this machine they've been working on. It's kind of like a system of the serpentine pipes. And they heated it to some ungodly temperatures and pressures. I think it was like, no, I don't remember. Basically, what they did is they simulated the conditions that happen in nature, in Mother Earth, when layers and layers of biomass pile on each other and sit like this for millions of years. When that happens, the end result is coal, oil, and methane. So they did it within this apparatus. Only instead of millions of years, it took them 15 minutes. And out came crude oil and some biogas. And so by tuning the system, you can get more crude oil or you can get more biogas. But the end result is basically you load up shit, out comes fuel. It still needs to be sort of refined. And they're already talking up to a refinery that wants this output, and because it actually gives them some carbon credits. And if this works, if you think about it, the residents of Vancouver will be basically driving their cars powered by their own poo.
Incredible.
Yeah.
Incredible. If you had to guess, like, how far away they are from doing that refining, the refining process, how long would you guess?
Well, the refining is not really, a challenge. Like this can be done any minute. So I know that the pilot plant has been running. I would say maybe for about a year, but it's still in a pilot mode, meaning that it's only a part of the sewage, the sewage that they get is being processed that way. The rest is still going, its regular way. Mm-hmm. Where they are, I know it's been working well, but they haven't implemented it for the entire city yet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, you go.
Oh, and I was just going to add to that. One of the things is that the technology, we already have the technology. It's a matter of scaling it up and basically investing in the infrastructure that we need to do this. So, what was fascinating, I think, for both of us when we were doing the research is that we already know how to do a lot of this stuff. It is the psychology, or it is the politics, or it is the lack of infrastructure spending that we can actually do this in a way that that makes sense. But we have the know-how in many cases to do this, and one of the other things that I just will add real quickly is that the same kind of technology is transferable to other forms of waste. So we're talking about poop, but we also have yard waste, we also have food waste, we have a ton of food waste in this country, farm waste, manure. So you think of all the other organic matter that we're not using, it starts to add up and really make a difference.
Right. Is it, I see Dan has a question. Okay. Do you think that the main barrier is just general disgust, either from, government or regular people?
I think it's a lack of awareness, for many people. I think, just talking about it, can help kind of create that awareness. I mean, disgust is a barrier to certain projects. I mean, it has been a barrier to water reclamation projects, for example. And now, 10 years later, they're like, oh, shit, we need to do something. We should have done this 10 years ago when we killed the project. So that can be a barrier, but I think a lot of it is just, spending the money up front and realizing that you're going to recoup this.
Right.
So people in this industry told me that when it comes to spending money on infrastructure, taxpayers will pay for clean water. There's no questions about it. But nobody wants to pay for wastewater.
Yeah.
Because like, why are we paying for it? I mean, this is waste. I'm like, nobody wants it. Why are we spending money on it? So awareness goes back to the awareness again.
That makes sense. All right, Dan, sorry.
Oh, thanks. So you're speaking to a room full of aspiring science journalists. And I think it's inspiring for them. They're aspiring, and you guys are inspiring in the sense of getting them to see, you know, that you're sort of you followed your passion. You went deep on this topic, and so I wanted to hear a little bit about the process of how you guys pulled this off. It's hard to write a book. It's also really hard to convince a publisher to publish a book. And we have all these hang-ups about poop. And I imagine that it was even harder for both of you. So how about some war stories for the pitching and publishing process? You know, how did you guys both pull this off? And is the fact that there are two of these books, how has that made a difference, or how, you know, has that mattered in any way? This is a historic occasion, by the way. This is the first time that Lina and Bryn have appeared together to talk poop.
Two authors,
Yeah.
number two. Yeah.
And number two.
Yes.
Exactly.
Do you want to go? Do you want me to go?
Go ahead.
You know, I think this is, you know, it's a quirky topic. It's a way into a larger discussion of you know, problems that we have around the world. But there are going to be some people that are just put off by it. You know, when I was looking for agents, I had a couple that basically said, ew, no. And then, you know, I had some that were like, gross, tell me more. You know, and I think that humor and kind of the, you know, slightly kind of quirky topic can actually be an advantage, because it starts a conversation that you might not have had otherwise, you know, with that person. You know, there's you know, a ton of poop puns. We have, you know, puns in our book, and my editor pulled me back from a few of them, wisely. But you know, that's a way of breaking the ice. So you know, I had to go through the process of finding agents, and basically it was a matter of just making a spreadsheet of, you know, everyone that I could think of. I worked with an accountability buddy, and we kind of went through the whole process of writing this proposal and, you know, mapping out all the chapters, and then kind of going through and saying, okay, you know, who might be a good fit for an agent, and then just pitching them. You know, and fortunately, you know, I landed a fantastic agent who was really excited about it and saw it as a way of, you know, talking about larger issues. And it really fit in with some of her other authors. And then was fortunate to land an amazing editor at Grand Central Publishing. So it's actually been a really gratifying journey. I mean, it was a long haul. You know, I started thinking about this back in 2014, you know, when I did a feature story about fecal transplants.
I remember it.
So yeah, but it's, you know, I think, you know, both of us, it has to be a passion project, you know, because it's one of those things that you're kind of constantly pestering people at parties, you know, like, hey, you know, did you know this? You know, you end up like, you know, throwing your poop trivia at them. But it has to be something that you know, you're passionate about, not just as a subject, but kind of what's the larger picture? Like what are you really wanting to say, you know, with a book? And I think that's, you know, when you can't stop talking about it, you know, then you know that this is something that you can pursue.
So I think that, you know, I wanted to do poop PR, but since I was like 8, maybe 10, I grew up in a very different world. I grew up in a former Soviet Union on a family farm. My grandfather had 2 degrees, one in engineering, another one in agriculture, and he fertilized our farm with the content of our septic system. Every fall, he would open up this tank. He would, you know, put on his like protective coveralls, take 2 big buckets, and spend several days taking that sludge and putting it onto our land, mostly in his rotating system of compost piles, which he would then close and let sit for 3 years. Coming home from school, I knew Grandpa was doing our annual plumbing maintenance from 2 miles away. It was unmistakable. But it wasn't disgusting. It was normal. That's how it was supposed to smell. That meant that when the next spring came around, we would have this incredible rich black dirt to grow food with, because that's what was inside those compost piles when he finally opened it up. And he used to say, you have to feed the earth the way you feed people. So to me, it was so normal, that cycle of life, that circle, was so normal that I thought the whole world lived the same way. So imagine my shocker when I learned that it wasn't the case. And I was so puzzled all the way into my adulthood. Like, how do these people live? Like, what do they eat? It doesn't make sense, and it doesn't make sense. And so I think I always had this poop book in me. I just didn't know how to go about it. Up until about 2011, when the Gates Foundation issued this Reinvent the Toilet Challenge, and I read about what they wanted, from this new types of toilets, to be sustainable, to be, compostable, and all kinds of things. And I was like, oh my God, this is what I always thought about, and look, Bill Gates is talking about it. There is light at the end of the tunnel. So I started writing stories about like this type of sustainable, methods, composting, whatnot. I wrote a couple of stories about poo. Every time I would write a story about poo, especially if there was a poo, or poo in the subject, it would hit like 100,000 hits in the first 2 hours. And some of them went on to win awards, and people started telling me, well, maybe you should think about a book. And I started thinking about a book. I was lucky in terms of finding my agent. I didn't realize that you went through like your spreadsheet and whatnot. I talked to a friend of mine who was transitioning from being an editor at Macmillan to being an agent. And I asked her to send me a couple of book proposals so I would have a clue of how to write one. And she did. A couple of months later, she landed, an agenting gig, and she started working with me. I think it took a year to finalize that proposal, because I had a lot of doubts if I was ever going to get anywhere. And then we signed a contract, and then she sent it. She sold it at an auction with three places bidding within 2 or 3 months. Notably, all of the big publishers passed on it, not because they didn't like the idea, not because they didn't like the writing, not because they didn't think it was original. They liked all of it. They said they didn't know how to discuss it at their editorial meetings, they didn't know how to market it, and they didn't know what to put on the cover.
But I think having two of the books now, I think it really does make it easier, now, because now we've kind of,
Broken the ice.
Broken the ice, cracked the lid, so.
The lid.
Sorry. But it does get easier to I think to talk about, because now, they were like, oh, well, maybe there's something to this, there are these books on it. So I do think it helps, and I think hopefully it continues the discussion.
It's interesting, though, that the publishers, in your case, had a hard time figuring out what to do with it, given that I would think that you saying, look, all of these articles that I've published were immediate successes with poop in the title, like this should be an easy sell. But I guess there's still a lot of stigma around.
There's still a lot of stigma.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot of people in the publishing industry feel they just don't know how to handle the topic.
Yeah. It's also a risk in a way that I guess writing an article may not be, because there's so much money that gets poured into it versus something that's much shorter that, it still obviously costs money to publish an article, but it's just a different scale.
Yeah, absolutely.
When I'm curious about the reporting process itself, you guys have had to go to some arguably pretty disgusting places. And first of all, I'm curious, first of all, this is a topic that you're both really interested in. And I'm curious how much you were challenged during the reporting to kind of face your own disgust. Yeah.
Well, one of the things that was I think, really, really interesting. So we went on a trip to Norway, and I've had this habit when we go on trips of going to visit wastewater treatment plants, which is maybe not the typical tourist destination. Some people go to museums or water parks. So I ended up visiting this plant on the outskirts of Oslo in Norway. But I did so because I had read about it, and it's basically built in the inside of a cave. So it's a very unusual location. Also because I knew that they were using the biogas to power their city buses. The engineer met me. She was also my guide, and she said, "Well, not a lot of people come here." So she was kind of delighted that I was there, a little confused as to why I was there. But she took me on this tour of the facility. But at one point where you have like these settling tanks, and the power had been out earlier in the day. So, they were supposed to have more of like this kind of, chocolate milk consistency, and it was basically like a half-baked brownie. And and so I was, was a little taken aback by that. And then I saw that on this tank, on the railing, they have life preservers. And I said, "Have you ever had to use those?" And she said, "No, but it calms people down." I said, okay. So I had this like flash of, like Willy Wonka chocolate factory. Like, this is not. But that was a moment where I was like, okay, what am I doing here? But you get used to it. You habituate to it. There have been moments, where they were testing the sewers for COVID, and we were going around the city of Tacoma in Washington, and they basically have these like giant Q-tips that they're sticking down, and like, oh, that's really good. Muck down there, we got a good one. And it turns out that that's really good for attracting the virus, because it basically kind of gloms onto kind of the fat. But it's basically like the stinkier, the better. So that was kind of unavoidable. But I think we're all disgusted by certain things. I'm disgusted by weird things too. But you kind of habituate and you acclimate when you have to. It's just like a parent changing a dirty diaper. I had so many parents that were telling me how disgusted they were with the diapers, and they were, dry heaving, and they're going into detail about just how gross it was. But then a couple months later, they're like, "Oh yeah, it was fine." So, I think for certain things, you get used to it.
Right. I think I probably had like maybe 2 moments, but I wouldn't call this disgust. I don't think I was really truly disgusted, maybe because of how I grew up. One of these moments was in Canada, where I was interviewing, and touring the plant by the company called Listic. What they do is they basically, whip that sewage in like a giant blender, and in some plants they keep it, they accumulate it for the next spring and the next fall. Basically, what my grandfather was doing, and then when the time comes, the trucks come, the trucks are loaded up, pumped into that sewage, and they take it out to the fields. And so we go into this building where this sewage, God knows from how many months, is sitting. And it's not disgusting, but Jesus, it's impossible to breathe in there. And I'm like getting dizzy, and I have to like hold on to things because I'm like swaying back and forth. And the gentleman who was taking me around and talking about it, he is just completely, she's just walking like he's, breathing fresh air. And finally, when we get out, I'm like half fainted. I'm like, "How can you breathe in there?" And he goes, "We're used to it." And the other moment was in Madagascar, where there's a little startup. So you can't really build flushing systems in Madagascar for a variety of reasons. It'd probably just ruin their ecology entirely, because the island floods all the time and the water is there all the time, and your systems would flood all the time. So what they're doing is they're going through the neighborhoods and they're gathering that night soil, just like people in China and Japan were doing, in these biodegradable bags, and they're taking these bags into their biodigester, and they're digesting it into whatever the next phase is, and they are at that point they were giving it out to farmers. I think they still give it out for free. And then so we do all that, and then the head of that whole operation goes, I want to show you our R&D lab. And I'm like, yeah, sure, let's do it. So we drive to like the other side of the city, and I am expecting an R&D lab. I don't know what I was thinking, but I expected an R&D lab like it is inside of a university. And we walk into this room, and everywhere in the room, like 6 feet tall and maybe even taller, there are crates of shit. like crates and crates and crates of shit. And we walk in, and there are 3 people walking there in gloves and head coverings, and they see me and they smile and they take off their gloves and they all go, hi. That's before COVID, that's 2018, okay? And I am standing there with like my notepad and my recorder. Oh, Jesus, shit, what do I do? Like, I have to, and they're standing there, and I'm like, I have to shake their hands. I'm impolite. And I shake their hands, and then I like try not to touch anything with my hand. Just like I'm holding my recorder, I push the button with my left, and I'm like, all right, I'm not touching anything. I'm not touching me. I'm just holding my, like, as far away from myself as possible. And that was really the moment of like serious freak out. And then I realized that when I came back to my hotel room, I realized that the other thing that I would never be able to do is to take off my shoes and put them in my my traveling bag. So I went out to the market. I bought an electric teapot. I boiled it, and I sat there on the floor of my bathroom, and I put it all over my shoes over and over and over again. So those were my moments.
Yeah. So, yeah. Oh.
Is it okay?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Hi, my name's Marlo. I'm one of the current Chirp students, and I'm super thrilled that you're both here talking to us about this, because I have written about this quite a bit, actually, previously in my very early career. But I even joked to friends of mine that I was a shit reporter, which is the reason why this conversation is totally exciting to me instead of disgusting. So this is great. I mean, I've done the whole wastewater tour, which is really, really cool, and I hope that everybody gets the chance to do that because it's actually awesome, and tracing COVID and stuff. One of the things that's really interesting to me that I focused on a lot, specifically in Florida, is septic tanks, and the issues that there are with poorly maintained tanks. It's something that's a barrier to homeowners because it's a huge expense. So even people like my own parents in Miami, Florida, it's something that they're not inclined to do because it's a huge expense. But then there's also people in places like Alabama, even in places in Florida, where proper sewage disposal is just not an option. And so I'm curious to know, kind of along the lines of what you were saying about Madagascar and how flooding's an issue, how the compounded effects of climate change and then communities who can't afford these options. Just a little bit about the environmental justice kind of component to this conversation and what you might have to say about that and any solutions that you think might be feasible.
Yeah, that is a tough question.
Yeah, I mean, it really is a social justice issue. Even in King County in Washington, where Seattle is, there is an astounding number of homes that are still using septic tanks. And a lot of those are poorly maintained, they're aging, they're incredibly expensive to maintain. One thing that people are pushing is looking at composting toilets as an affordable alternative. And not just as like a standalone, home, here and there, but almost thinking of it as like eco districts, or like tying them together so that you would have someone who would do the maintenance similar to the way that they maintain septic systems now, because that model already exists. And so part of it is thinking about container-based solutions, which Lina was talking about. And we don't like to think about that as being an option here in the United States. But if you think about composting toilets, it really is like a container-based sanitation solution. And it works not just for places where there's no infrastructure at all, and for various reasons, environmental racism among others. There have been entire communities that have been left out of infrastructure. So there's that. There's also a lot of older homes where it's basically you have septic systems that are leaking into the ocean and kind of destroying people's livelihoods. So I think there is been a more attention to like how do you tie together environmental justice, sanitation, looking at some of these solutions and thinking about it a little bit more holistically, because it is about disease, about sanitation, but it's also about polluting the environment around you, because a lot of these places you have like these straight pipes that are basically just kind of going right into the ocean or the nearest body of water, and then contaminating drinking water, as well. So I think it is definitely an environmental justice issue, and I think there are organizations. Flush is one of them, PHLUSH. There's a great book, and I'm blanking on the name, but it was Waste Flowers, Catherine Coleman Flowers, who wrote about the situation in Alabama, and so and that's an amazing book. So yeah, I mean, fortunately, people are talking about it more, but again, it comes down to actually spending the money and the infrastructure to make that happen.
So there are people who are working on very, very simple solutions to such situations, and that is composting toilets. I'm blanking out on the name, but there is a company that this young woman created maybe 2 years ago. She works with people who live in reservations or really rural places on helping them build composting toilets that are not unpleasant to use, that don't smell, don't gather, don't attract flies, that are easy to unload and compost with other, biomass like, trees or, or dead plants. Her name is Kelsey McWilliams, and she is in Pennsylvania, and I can't remember the name of her company. That is probably the simplest and the cheapest solution because the investments are really, really small. Interestingly enough, that all these septic tanks that were installed somewhere in the 70s, they were actually thought to be better than building municipal sanitation because it didn't have to be big. You didn't have to dig up all this earth. You didn't have to put down miles and miles of pipes. They thought to be more ecologically savvy. And turned out they were not. They had a whole slew of their own problems. How to go about changing all of them, I don't know. I don't think the simple solution may not necessarily be to change all of them. It's probably more dependent on where you live, what means you have, and what other people around you are capable of doing with you together.
Hey guys, so I haven't read, this particular question is for Bryn. So I haven't read Flush, but I was actually checking its review, and I found it quite interesting, one of your experiment that you examine your stool daily for a year using 3 applications that tracked frequency, speed of transit, quantity, consistency, and color. What was the finding? And I think you also end up sequencing gut microbiome or something. I'm kind of curious about that.
I did. Yeah, it's actually close to 2 years now because I just got in the habit of doing it. Right?
It's addictive.
Yeah, so I have. There are 3 apps. I mean, and they're kind of hilarious. One is called Plop. One's called Poo Keeper. I mean, they're very cute. And and they give you, it's like there's like a little pep talk. You know, it got like a little gold star for pooping, basically, on one of them. But what they are is basically a way to kind of enhance your observation. You know, so you know, some people use a notepad. You know, and this is just an easy way of doing it. The reason I did it is because I wanted to write about it, and I thought, well, if I'm writing about it, I should probably, you know, try it myself, you know, and see what it is. But basically, it gives you a baseline of what's normal for you, because it turns out that what's normal and what's abnormal is there's a huge range. So there used to be this idea that, you know, normal transit was like this very specific, you know, time. Well, it was because they were looking at, you know, wealthy British men who ate specific diets, right? Well, it turns out if you increase your diversity of people, you're going to find a very wide range of what's normal. So, so part of it was just basically getting myself used to the idea of doing this and figuring out what was normal. For sequencing the microbiome, I basically just sort of wanted to geek out and see, you know, what are the microbes that are basically sharing my body with me. And what I think was fascinating about that is probably half of them, we have absolutely no idea what they do. So they would say things like, you know, isolated from the poop of a healthy 25-year-old. And that's it. We don't know anything. So I think what's exciting about it is that there's a lot left to learn. But that's also sort of like the daunting thing, is that, like, we don't know shit about shit. You know?
Just a quick follow-up. So what makes a good poop?
Well, I would say we in the Western world probably lack what makes a good poop, because if you think about it, we have a fiber deficit, so we're not eating the fiber that we need. And so if you look at volume, our volume is probably half of what it is in other parts of the world, and that's because they're eating a lot more vegetables, for example, and so they have fiber. Also things like fermented foods, which we tend not to eat, and fermented foods and fiber together can kind of help feed the microbes and create more diversity. Because ultimately what you want is a more diverse ecosystem, because that's what it is. It's an ecosystem. You have predators, you have prey, you have all kinds of different things fighting for space, but it's an ecosystem, and the more different types that you have, generally the better.
You know, for references, there is a thing out there called the Bristol chart. Google it, and it'll tell you what's, you know, from good to bad and everything in between.
Yeah, that's for consistency. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for coming in. My name's Kylie. I'm a current CHIRP student. My question is about ethics. So some of the coverage I've seen of wastewater surveillance has mentioned some ethical concerns with it. And I was thinking, when you brought up the apps as well, is there like a privacy element to health tracking with waste?
Yeah, absolutely. So wastewater tracking can be incredibly useful for public health. You know, it dates back to the 30s for polio. And you can, you know, detect a number of different viruses, antibiotic resistance, but you can also start to get at the drug use for communities, right? And so then as you narrow down from the wastewater treatment plant to the level of neighborhoods or even blocks, then you start to get into some of these sort of ethical issues of like, you know, are you going to the point where you can actually identify, you know, potentially whose, you know, sample you're looking at, right? Or get an idea of like, okay, this block we have, you know, more of a problem with opioid use. I mean, there are a lot of ethical issues, and in fact, there was a study in Australia where they basically were able to profile these different neighborhoods based on what they found in terms of the different types of pharmaceuticals that they were using, and saying, okay, well, this is an older part of the neighborhood because of, you know, these drugs, you know, more for like heart failure, or blood pressure, things like that. Here, there's a lot more antidepressants, things like that. So, you can really do some snooping, on neighborhoods through this. And I think that is an ethical discussion that we need to have, because I think a lot of people don't really realize the level of information that you can reveal about communities. And in COVID, you were taking this down to the level of single buildings. There were dorms, University of Arizona is one example. There were many colleges that were doing this, but they were able to avert outbreaks by finding these silent clusters, of students that had COVID but didn't know they had it. But again, you're dependent on then testing everyone afterwards and then finding the students, right? So by design, you're invading the privacy because you're identifying, these particular students had this silent outbreak. So they agreed to do that, but not everyone might agree to do that, right? So what's the balance between, personal privacy and public health? So that's a conversation that we need to have, I think.
We have time for a few more questions, so if anyone has them, please head up to the mic. But in the meantime, I have a question. So we have laughed a lot tonight, and you both have written very funny books. So I'm curious, sort of your thinking on how you use humor to talk about disgusting stuff, particularly poop, and then also with your sources, how your sources feel about the fact that you're making light in a certain way of what they do. They may be all for it, but I'm just curious how that's kind of gone down with them.
I love the gun down part. What I found while I was working on the book and after the book came out, because I got invited to talk at all these different wastewater conferences and whatnot, is that people who work in the sanitation industry, and particularly in wastewater treatment, are incredibly, wonderfully wacky group of people. They're just so much fun to hang out with. They think so differently from the rest of us, which is probably why they are in this profession. So they also use humor a lot when they talk about things. The vast majority of them. Some are more serious, but a lot of them really, love humor, and they make poopy jokes a lot, too.
Great to hear.
I've had so much fun at this conference as I can't even begin to tell you. That was the fun part of, after the book came out. I realized that I really found a really dedicated, loyal audience. Who were so excited that there is a book about them in such a way that it sort of portrays them as heroes who keep us all clean and decent and healthy. So I guess, that's my answer to the question. So yeah, humor floats perfectly.
Yeah, I think, most of my sources were good sports about it, and some of them were just hilarious. There was an anthropologist in Denmark, and her specialty is basically recreating diets based on latrines. So there happens to be actually a lot of old latrines littered about Denmark, and she has become sort of the go-to person when they find a new one, from the Renaissance. They're like, oh yeah, okay, she's our latrine expert, and so I'm like, well, how many are there? And, there's like dozens of them that, will get buried when they're repaving a road or something like that. And then they find like this repurposed wine barrel. And she can basically recreate what they ate in, a particular household or a particular block, the trading routes that they had, how many parasites they had, what was the health. But basically, people in Denmark kind of embraced this, and it became so popular that they had these mornings at the National Museum for kids. And they called him Crap Saturday or Crap Morning was the name of it. It was like this like hit. So they just like fully embraced the humor there. And so I think again, that's a way in for people to have like these discussions. And another example was beer ends up being a great way to talk about water reclamation because brewers love the idea of starting with a blank slate of water. So if you can strip everything away from wastewater and turn it back into just regular pure water, the brewers can create any kind of beer they want. They're not dependent on the profile of the tap water of the city, for example. But what they would do is then start creating these like ridiculous names for their beer. And so the sponsors had to kind of reel them back in, because there was like IPA, and, brown trout ale. And they're like, okay, no. let's go back to like, pure water brew. So sometimes the humor maybe got a little much.
When I used to make a YouTube channel called Gross Science, all about disgusting stuff, and somebody mailed me a case of beer made from wastewater.
There you go.
It was actually very delicious.
Yeah. No, they love it.
Yeah. All right.
Hi, my name is Delaney, and I wanted to go back and ask a little bit more about how climate change is going to be affecting wastewater systems, and less so at the individual level, but more so at the broader systems level. I'm curious if in any of the wastewater treatment plants that you have toured, if they have started implementing adaptation, especially for increasing intense storms and storm surge and other things that are causing these big wastewater treatment plants to possibly flood.
That's a great question. The answer is yes and no, because what seems to work even 10 years ago isn't necessarily working anymore because the storms are getting intense. So it's, to answer in short, it's an ongoing process that I think all of our wastewater treatment plants will have to somehow revisit and keep on going. Unfortunately, it's not a very satisfying answer. I don't know if Bryn has anything to add.
I can give you two examples, one here in New York. So New York has a combined sewer system. So when it rains, it even rains a little bit, it tends to overwhelm the sewer system, and so they have to have relief valves. And unfortunately, a lot of those valves are the waterways of the city. And so you have Newtown Creek in Brooklyn, for example, Brooklyn and Queens, and that is one of the designated overflow sites. So when you have a storm, basically you have the choice of either having raw sewage in the streets or raw sewage being flushed out into places like Newtown Creek. And so this has become a really big issue because, of course, now the storms are more intense than they were before. So the city has this huge tunnel project that you may have heard about where they're trying to store some of the excess stormwater. The problem is that they base their calculations on rainfall averages that are now becoming obsolete because of because of global warming. There's more rain. So one of the options that there's a group called the Newtown Creek Alliance, and that they're pushing is more green infrastructure in the city. So bioswales are one idea of sopping up some of the stormwater. But they're also pushing other things like more green roofs. So there's a beautiful green roof in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, actually right by the Newtown Creek water treatment plant. And what it does is it's providing habitat for birds and bees and butterflies. It is helping to reduce the temperature because we know that urban heat islands are a huge problem in cities. And it's also sopping up some of the excess stormwater so that if you have enough of them, you won't have as much runoff into the sewer system and overwhelming. So that's one example. One other quick example is on the West Coast in the Bay Area. They're experimenting with what they call horizontal levees, and they're basically these vegetated slopes. And what they do is they provide further treatment for water as it's percolating down into San Francisco Bay. At the same time that the vegetated levee, the way that it is built, is providing some additional protection from storm surges. So it's doing a dual purpose of further cleaning the water, providing some habitat, and then also building in a bit of resiliency. And again, both of those are, sort of new ways of thinking about how do we deal with waste. One of them is technically part of the wastewater treatment district, but the Newtown Creek Alliance is, thinking a little bit more outside of the box. How do we deal with this problem?
A slightly more indirect effect that wastewater treatment plants can have on climate change or battling the results of climate change is that some of them are now using these things called BNRs, biological nutrient removal systems. And what they do is they chemically remove that excess nitrogen from the effluent. So when that effluent comes out, it's not as damaging to marshes or mangrove forests, both of which ultimately protect the coastal areas from flooding. So all in all, probably a lot more wastewater treatment plants will need those systems installed to offset what the damage done and to rebuild this damage done, because once we start messing with nature, nature will recover. So that's probably another way wastewater treatment plants can do it.
But right, it's just a matter of money. And
It's a matter of money. Yeah.
It's always money, yeah.
Hi, my question's about the gut microbiome. I've done some reporting on it this semester, and I think it's a really exciting thing to write about. There's a lot being written about it, and it's sort of hyped up as being like, oh, there's so much we could learn here, but there's also so much we don't know, as you said, about what's going on in the gut microbiome, and so it seems like there could be some leading promises there about all the possibilities. So I'm curious how you suggest reporting on things like that, where the science is still catching up and there's a lot of exciting things happening, but there's not always a ton that we can say yet. And it seems like there's a lot of that in the poop area. So like how you suggest reporting on that and sort of being ahead of it, but not too early, I guess.
That's such a rich topic. I don't know. Do you want to go first?
You can go first.
I kind of want to tell a little bit of a story before I answer that question. When I was in college, ages and ages and ages ago, as a very recent immigrant who had no money and was working 40 hours a week and eating crap and sometimes not eating because I had no money. By the time I graduated from college, I had massive digestive problems, massive. No matter what I ate, I had stomach aches. By then I had medical insurance and I started going to doctors, and this is the conversation I had with my gastroenterologist, which was probably third or fourth gastroenterologist. We're talking about 20, 30 years ago. I asked him, you know what, nothing you're giving me is really helping. Can we see what microbes live in me? Maybe I picked up some really bad microbes. Can we do a test? And his answer was, there are no microbes in your stomach. The stomach acid kills everything. And I looked at him I couldn't believe that I heard this from my doctor. I felt like he'd just fallen off the moon. But that was the science. That's what they were taught in medical school. He was a really old guy. So fast forward to 20, 30 years, ahead, it's almost, people are talking about the fact that by changing gut microbiome, you can cure all kinds of things. You can cure diabetes, you can fix metabolic problems, you can even, maybe you change, how a person's organs are working, the immune system, everything. So it's a matter of time. The science moves slow. It should move slow because it should make, assumptions that are not fully proven. I think your best bet in terms of reporting on gut microbiome, which is definitely the future, is just reading a lot. Whenever a new study comes out, reading through the study and trying to see if it makes sense. What else had come out in the past 10 years, 5 years that either proves or disproves it. what have these researchers found? What is the size of this study? Is it 10 people or is it 10,000 people? Is it, like, what is the demographic in the population? Is it a really diverse demographic from 18 to 68, or is that, a small set of people, for example? It's going to be an incredibly exciting branch of science for the next 20, 30 years, and probably then some. But it's just going to move slow. Having said that, the amount of research that has been done on it is tremendous. I would just recommend reading and searching and digging and finding as much as you can, and of course speaking to like a really, really diverse crew of sources.
Yeah, just to echo what Lina said, I mean, I think a healthy dose of skepticism is warranted. I mean, even if you think about fecal microbiota transplants for C. diff infections, the actual transplants themselves are wildly effective, but it's been quite a struggle to get FDA approval for some of the therapies that are coming out. We're starting to see some of them that are probably, the first one may come out in January or so, and then we might start to see some other ones. But you have basically this new paradigm where it's not a single target that you're targeting with a single drug. You're taking more of this ecological approach, trying to rebalance the gut. That's entirely new for science, and that's one of the reasons that the FDA struggled so much with what do we do with this? And there are different mechanisms at play. So if you think about the way that it might work for a C. diff infection, you have basically this weedy microbe that can get into your gut. If you think about a fecal transplant, it's kind of like replanting your garden in a way that kind of crowds out, the bad microbes. But as you get to more complicated things like autoimmune diseases, there may be a much more complicated mechanism at play. So it's not just about crowding it out. It's like, okay, what are the proteins that these particular microbes are producing that might have an effect? So there's what works in one type of a disease isn't necessarily going to have any sort of effect in another. So I think follow the money because there's a lot of money to be made, right? And so there are a lot of claims that aren't necessarily backed up by good science. But I think kind of understanding what's possible to learn, and we have a ton left to learn. Will probably help guide you.
I mean, there's also a lot of money in like the current system and like our sort of slash and burn like model of medicine that is, very entrenched, and lots of pharmaceutical companies are making a ton of money off of antibiotics.
Right, and they would love to on this as well. Yeah.
By the way, one person that I feel that patients really have to think in this whole pushing the FDA to really consider fecal transplants seriously in the very early stages is this woman patient. Her name was Catherine Duff, and she was basically dying from the C. difficile infection. She had like 6 bouts of them in the course of 3 or 4 years, and she was one of the first people who did it at her home with her husband in a blender because she literally had nothing to lose. She almost died several times. And it worked so effectively and efficiently that within 24 hours she was back on her feet, left her house, which she hadn't left for weeks, and was driving a car. And she was that citizen scientist who went into one of these public FDA meetings where several dozens doctors presented their findings, and and the FDA reps listened to it and said, well, we're going to take it all and we're going to think and we're going to decide what we're going to do. And she went up to the mic and did this incredible told them this incredible personal story, at the end of which she cried and said, all I want to do is to live. And people like me, all we want to do is to live. For how long are you going to sit there and decide what's working and what's not working? Give us a way to do it in the meantime. And they created this loophole for doctors to be able to do it, to administer the fecal transplants to patients. In the meantime, while they were figuring out how to regulate it. I wrote a story about her, and I spent hours with her on the phone. And by the time she was finished telling me her story, we both sat there and cried, like on both sides of the phone. That was kind of like the times before Zoom. So I guess I'm saying all this because behind all this science and all these studies, there are also people, and they sometimes can give your story an absolutely incredible, depth and this human touch.
I think that's a great place to leave it. Bryn and Lina, thank you so much for being here and talking shit with us.
Thanks so much. It's been a pleasure.